What is the proper role of the federal government? It's a question that's at the heart of many of our national public policy debates.
In a nation this big, you need responses that are tailored to state level, county level, city level problems instead of a one-size-fits-all, because one size never actually fits anyone.
On this episode, we sit down with Representative Celeste Maloy of Utah's 2nd Congressional District to get her insights on the proper balance between federal and state authority on a range of issues. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. This episode of Defending Ideas is brought to you by Zions Bank, sponsor of the 2024 Sutherland Institute Congressional Series. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about the role of government, specifically at the federal level, what they should do, what they shouldn't do, and what the best relationship is between the federal government and states to solve really important policy challenges that we all talk about around the kitchen table that we're concerned about. And who better to have on to have that conversation than a representative of one of Utah's congressional districts to the federal government. It's Congresswoman Celeste Maloy. Thank you so much for being with us on Defending Ideas.
I'm excited to be here.
So, Representative, I want to talk to you about first kind of jumping into this question of the role of the federal government, the role of states. We all, of course, have witnessed, and we've talked about on this show previously, the growth of the federal government, the federal bureaucracy. We've talked a lot about the Chevron decision and what that means. So there's obviously a sort of a long-standing context of discussion about the true nature and purpose of the federal government. And I want to ask you kind of the broad question first of all. Why is federalism important? It's kind of this constitutional principle maybe sometimes we forget. Maybe just to tee that up with our audience, what is that principle in your view? Why is it really important, especially for us to be aware of during an election year?
Yeah, so, the concept of federalism is that the states are sovereign, and they got together and decided to form a federal government, a national government, and they agreed to give up a certain amount of that sovereignty to the federal government, but they retained everything else. And it is, especially at the time, it was a really unique idea in government, but it still is. I've done some traveling as a member of Congress to other countries, and it's something that they ask about a lot because we are a really big nation. 50 states, and we cover a lot of ground, and there are a lot of variables across the country. And if you're in a small country, I just got back from Finland, Norway, Sweden. I was on a CODEL there with the Natural Resources Committee, and they don't have the same concept of states because their entire nation is smaller than most states. But it was brilliant of our founding fathers to realize in a growing country that they would need to divide that power. And we've got to always be watching that line and policing that line, or we will lose what's unique about our government. And what's unique about it is the multiple layers of accountability and the checks and balances. So you asked why federalism is so important. When the states and the federal government are holding each other accountable, the citizens win. That accountability keeps Americans free. It's the best system I've ever become aware of for protecting individual freedom. And when the federal government gets too powerful and starts to overreach into the state's jurisdiction, then they can infringe on freedoms, and the states aren't as good at protecting it. When they fight back and jealously guard their sovereignty, then that keeps us all free of government overreach.
So what's the right balance? I think a lot of folks watching and listening out there, and myself included, can sometimes feel frustrated that it just seems like at times the federal government can kind of do what it wants and states are sort of an afterthought, which clearly wasn't the design, wasn't the intent of our constitutional system. So how would you describe the right balance between federal and state governments, and maybe are there specific issue areas where you think the federal government needs to pull back a little bit and states need to elevate?
There are a lot of areas. We could get into specifics, but the crux of the problem, as I see it, is that the executive branch specifically has gotten too powerful. So not only is our system of government divided between states and the federal government, but then within the federal government, there's the legislative, judicial, and executive branch, and they're supposed to jealously guard their jurisdiction from each other. And that is another way of holding government accountable, keeping everyone in their lane, and making sure that Americans stay free and their personal liberties protected. That's the point of government, to protect individual freedoms. When the legislative branch started delegating a lot of its authority to the executive branch, under this theory in the New Deal era, that having technocrats run a lot of these agencies in different areas of life would mean that we would have detached scientists who are making good decisions that are good for the people, and they're free of political pressures. Well, it turns out political pressures are actually a good thing, because political pressure comes from the people. And when you have technocrats that grow into a big bureaucracy and they're shielded from accountability to people, then they start to really believe that they're smarter than everybody and should run our lives. And some of the specific examples are, if you are an American trying to live your life, you're regulated, the car you drive by multiple agencies, the roads you drive on by multiple agencies, the schools your kids go to by multiple agencies, the food you eat, the medicine you take, the air you breathe, the water you drink. And all of it started from some good place. Somebody had a good idea. Government should help us, make sure that the water we drink is clean. I don't think anybody has a problem with making sure our water's clean. But once you create the bureaucracy, it becomes its own entity that doesn't want to die. So it's always looking for more money, more power, and new things to do. And now 80 years into this idea that technocrats and people with lab coats and clipboards and degrees are going to keep us safe, we've seen it for 3 generations now. We know it's not actually keeping us more free. So it's time to rein that back in. And the good news is, I think we're actually turning that corner. I think everybody can see that it's time to rein it in. I'm excited. I'm brand new in Congress, and I think this is a really exciting time to be there, even though politically we're a little chaotic right now. But I think the chaos is coming from, everyone can tell that there's a shift happening, and everybody's trying to steer what direction we're going. But I think we're going in a good direction. The court overturned the Chevron case. They're saying that they don't owe any deference to agencies. They never did. And they're also saying the legislative branch doesn't owe any deference to agencies, and we need to do a better job of saying what the laws mean so that agencies aren't left to interpret it. And I think that's a good thing. I think that'll help restore that balance between the 3 branches and keep us competing and keep Americans free of some of the onerous regulations that have sprung up. Some of the examples, the waters of the U.S. rule. Congress passed a law that says the federal government has jurisdictions over waters of the U.S. Agencies keep redefining what that means. And agencies don't redefine things to limit their own authority. They always redefine it in a way that gives them more authority. And I remember a few years ago listening to a congressional hearing where someone asked, so the Obama WOTUS rule expanded that authority a lot. Then the Trump administration WOTUS rule brought that authority back, made it smaller, which is a rare thing. So there was a hearing going on in Congress, and someone asked one of the witnesses, I believe from the EPA, to define what damage was caused by limiting that authority. And what she cited was, there are a lot of rivers and streams, I think she said 18,000, that we don't have authority over anymore. And then I was waiting for her to say that something awful had happened. She didn't. Her only evidence was, we used to have authority and now we don't. And that's somehow damaging to the American people. And implicit in that assumption is that states can't regulate water. They can't regulate rivers and streams and creeks and keep them clean and make sure we have drinking water. And states can and will and should do that. They have every incentive to do it. States don't want people dying from unclean water either. But we've just gotten in the habit over 80 years of assuming that if the federal government has authority over it, then they need to have authority over it.
Can I ask you about that? Because it seems to me that in the context of challenges to federalism, which again is an important constitutional principle that again I think we sometimes forget in our policy conversations as a people, as a country. I wonder if one of those challenges is that when we have debates about regulation of streams and waterways or whatever the issue is, it seems like the debate always goes to, well, what's the quote unquote best outcome? And when we only fixate on that, and sort of the discussion sidesteps, well, there's actually a constitutional principle and a constitutional process, because first we have to identify, is the correct level and branch of government doing what it should be doing in terms of jurisdiction of this issue? And it seems like we totally gloss over that question, and it's almost like voters are looking at it saying, well, if the federal government exceeding its authority is giving me policy outcomes that I like, then I'm fine. And that seems wrong. We need to return the constitutional principle of federalism.
Even people who in a setting like this would talk about federalism will show up in their congressman's office and say, what are you doing about whatever problem, without saying, should the federal government be involved in this? I'll give you kind of a lighthearted example. During COVID, everybody watched the Tiger King documentary. Even I did. It was trash, but we all watched it because we were bored, right? And it was streaming. And a lot of the content for that documentary was about the attempt to get the Big Cat Act passed. So everybody watched Tiger King, and then it became a hot topic on the Hill again, and everybody started talking about, is this act going to pass? And what they would talk about is whether people should be able to own, exotic, large, predatory animals. And every time someone would ask me about it, I'd say, it's a state issue. I don't know why we're talking about, a federal bill. And about half the time when I would say that, people would say, oh, yeah, that's right. But you had to bring it up. It wasn't originally part of the conversation. So they watched the documentary. They saw that there are some people out there who have questionable ethics, who own large cats, and they're like, so are we going to pass the bill? Well, we don't need the federal government to solve that problem. But we're out of the habit of asking that question. Like, is this a federal problem? Is it something the states would handle better?
Are there specific things that come to your mind when you have these kinds of conversations with folks, whether it's constituents or other policymakers or your colleagues in Congress? Are there specific issues that sort of just rocket to the top of your mind saying, this is a great example of where states are actually doing a really great job? They don't need sort of federal intervention. And I'll start off, one that always comes to mind for me is the fact that Utah is unique and that we have what's called a one-door model when it comes to workforce services and welfare resources consolidated under one state agency. I used to work for that agency. They do phenomenal work. And so we're sort of the gold standard, but that's because we were grandfathered into federal legislation decades ago. And so that's just one example. But what comes to mind for you? Where are states really good at this to help pave the way for maybe more authority returning to the states?
So there are a lot of areas. I think the social welfare programs are a really good example. States can do those programs in ways that are tailored to their state's needs, and they're nimble enough to change if they realize it's not working or they can't afford it. Obviously, when the federal government puts a social safety net into place, we all know that it's headed towards a fiscal cliff, and we're really slow to change it or to adjust. And one size doesn't fit all in this country. But one of the things that comes to mind for me, because it's a piece of legislation that I introduced, is permitting. I introduced the FREE Act, and what it does is require agencies to go look at the permits they issue and determine which ones would benefit from a permit by rule regime. So states are really good at this. If you go to a state generally and you need a permit to grade a road or, put in a new mailbox or whatever it is you're asking for a permit, they usually have a checklist. If you do these things, you can get a permit. They usually have an amount of time they have to determine whether you're going to get a permit. When you're getting a federal permit, a lot of times there are no time limits and there's not really a process. So you go to an agency and say, I'm applying for a permit to improve this pond that's starting to fill up with silt. And the person you apply to has a lot of autonomy to decide whether to give you that permit. And sometimes you get really caught up in personality politics where that person doesn't like enlarging ponds and so they just drag their feet. Sometimes you run into incompetence issues where the person you apply to doesn't know whether they should approve it and there's no pressure on them to make a decision, so they just sit on it. And sometimes it is just bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does. So the person you handed the permit application to sends it to somebody else, and it sits on their desk for a while, and then they send it to somebody else, and it's just inefficient because there's no accountability. So what I'm trying to do is make it so that agencies that are issuing permits have some structure to their permit process and some deadlines, because what happens too often, especially with infrastructure type projects, if you're trying to build a road, and there's one in Washington County, the Northern Corridor, that I worked on as a deputy county attorney. I worked on it as a staffer. Now I'm working on it as a member of Congress. It's been in the works for 30 years because there are multiple federal agencies that have to approve a permit. And even though there is a act of Congress, a bill that's been signed into law that provides for this road, there are people in these agencies that say, I don't think it's appropriate to build a road there. And they have been able to drag their feet for decades and keep the county from building this road that's been on their transportation plan for more than 30 years. That just isn't the way we should do things in this country. Not only is it frustrating that the road doesn't exist yet, but that road would have been much less expensive to build 30 years ago than it is now. So taxpayers have borne the burden of all of the process. You know, it's a county working with federal government and the state Department of Transportation is involved. All of those things are taxpayer funded. And now the road, if it gets built, will be even more expensive, also on the taxpayer's dime. And at the end of the day, I mean, let's say it would have cost $10 million to build that road 30 years ago. I don't know if that's accurate. And now it probably would cost $100 million to build the same road. And we're not getting 10 times better road. We're just getting 10 times more expensive road. And that's what states do better than the federal government. Although I will say, the more we all get used to these onerous federal processes, the more states start to mimic them. So it's time to bring the federal government down to the state level so the state doesn't keep going up to the federal level.
What's the solution to something like that? I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was when it comes to federal regulatory overreach, one common theme is sort of the role of the judicial branch. You mentioned the Chevron decision. You know, there obviously can be a role for courts, but either that issue, the Northern Corridor, or something like that, where it's in federal statute, but if state agencies are dragging their feet or doing whatever...
Federal agencies.
Yes, if federal agencies are kind of slow-walking this thing, is there a judicial oversight role? Does Congress need to do something else? What's the right mechanism to fix that kind of thing in your mind?
So I think the right mechanism has already been triggered. I think we're going to watch it play out over the next little while. So the court, I think, has been almost daring the legislative branch to step up and do a better job for the last few years. And in overturning Chevron, I think they really threw down the gauntlet. Now they've said, we don't owe deference to agency decisions. They get their authority from Congress. Congress delegated them authority to do this, and they have to do what Congress has told them to do. And originally, the Chevron doctrine was that in the absence of clarity from Congress, an agency can interpret as long as their interpretation doesn't clearly violate what Congress said. And that deference has grown and expanded in the last 40 years to where agencies are interpreting things in ways that I think clearly do violate what Congress has said. So what I can do as a member of the legislative branch is write laws that are more clear and work with my colleagues to write laws that are more clear. We can also defend our territory through the power of the purse. We fund these agencies. And in their budgets, we can say no funds shall be used for. So we can keep trimming agencies back down to the size they were intended to be by the legislative process and by the budget process. And one of the tools I think we underuse in Congress is that first section of a bill that nobody ever reads, the findings and the sense of Congress. Instead of, we agonize over getting the language of the bill right, but we underuse our ability to say at the beginning, this is what we're trying to accomplish with this bill. It sends a clear message to the agency. It also sends a clear message to the court. Bills get litigated. Agency actions get litigated. And now courts are saying we're not going to defer to the agency, so we need to make it clear to courts what we wanted agencies to do. And I think that's something that we'll get better at as a legislative branch. So I think that is the answer to the problem that we've been describing. And I think we're already in the process of starting to implement it.
There's one other thing I want to ask you about in terms of federal regulations. And then I do want to touch on public lands as well. That's a huge issue here in Utah, of course. But in terms of federal overreach, another issue that's come up often, especially a lot recently, is federal agency guidance letters. So federal agencies essentially sending a letter to a state entity saying, hey, we think you should do this. Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that those letters are not technically legally binding, but there's sort of an implied threat behind it sometimes, that if you're a school that receives federal funding, if you're a state agency that receives federal funding, there's naturally an incentive to do what the federal agency guidance letter says, but that's not necessarily something that was prescribed by law from Congress. Help us make sense of that.
So I think it's a symptom of the same disease we've been talking about. So we've had this bureaucracy that just has grown and grown and grown for 80 years. And part of that bureaucracy is that the federal government's used to attaching strings to everything. Agencies are used to attaching strings to everything. And they say, if you want to improve a pond on your property, you need a permit. And if you want to get the permit, then you've got to do this wetland mitigation. And the wetland mitigation has to be done this certain way, and it has to be approved by this entity. And we've all kind of gotten used to jumping through a lot of hoops. And so they just keep creating hoops because it's what they do. And we're all so trained that if a federal agency says you have to do it this way, then you have to do it that way. And I think overturning Chevron, a lot of people wrote about it, but it also happened in a busy political season, and it's kind of flown under the radar. I think we're going to look back at it as a landmark moment in federalism and balance of powers. And I think we're headed in the right direction. I know a lot of people don't feel that way. If you're listening to talk radio or you're watching cable news, they talk about the things that are broken, and those are so obvious. And it takes a little more digging to see that there's an undercurrent of people are recognizing what it's going to take to fix it, and some of those things are starting to happen. I'm on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I'm also on the Small Business Committee. And in hearings with both of those committees, even Democrats are saying, small businesses can't survive with some of these EPA regulations, or we can't get infrastructure projects built because of permitting problems with how slow it is to get a permit. And Democrats tend to be the party that's usually more favorable to the administrative state, to having technocrats make decisions. Republicans are usually the ones who are wanting to rein the federal government in. I think we've gotten to where there's a big enough mass in Congress of people who can see that the bureaucracy is serving its own needs and not the American people's needs, that we might actually be able to get some bipartisan movement on these issues. And as closely divided as the federal government is right now and has been for the last several years, it's probably going to take bipartisan agreement. I think we're there.
We've got a few minutes left, so let's talk public lands for a minute. And then if we have time, I might ask you about kind of how federalism can be an antidote to polarization, kind of in broad strokes. But I want to make sure we give due time to public lands. Again, that this has been a very important issue for Utah for many, many years. I think so. I grew up in Nevada, which is either, it might be the only state or maybe one of two that has more land controlled by the federal government than Utah, but it's very close. I don't remember the exact.
It's the only one.
Okay.
I also grew up in Nevada.
Oh, great. And so, kind of as Westerners, we've sort of lived this our whole lives. And one of the things I love about Utah is that we have lots of outdoor areas to go and enjoy the peace and quiet that the West brings. That being said, it just seems like this is an issue that keeps coming up over and over again. You've spent time and effort on this. The state of Utah is, of course, investing some resources trying to fix this. Help us make sense of that issue. Where does it stand today in your mind? What's your view on how to fix sort of this conflict between the federal government and the state with control of huge swaths of land here in Utah?
Yeah, I think this is an example of what you talked about earlier in this podcast, where people want a certain outcome and they forget about whether we're getting there in the right way. So there are a lot of people in this country who like open space. They like the idea that there are places they can go hike. They like the idea of national parks. And a lot of them are here in Utah. I like that we have a lot of open space. I work in Washington, D.C. about 3/4 of the time. And when I get on I-15 and I can set my cruise at 80, which is the speed limit and where I always set it, and just drive and not have a lot of people around me, it is good for my soul. My blood pressure returns to normal. I love to be outside and away from crowds. It's great that we have this, but we need to get back to this fundamental question: who should be managing the land, and what should they be managing it for? And we skip past that a lot of times with federal land and start arguing about whether it's a good thing to have open space. When I was in law school, I read a study that, the majority of Americans like the idea of wilderness. If you poll Americans, most of them are going to say we love wilderness. Now, if you ask them how to define wilderness, then, they all have different definitions, but we spend a lot of time, those of us who work in land policy, arguing over whether improving a road will harm a wilderness area. Almost nobody cares about that. They just like knowing that there are open spaces out there. The state could manage open spaces, but we've had it all be federal for so long that it's hard to shift people's mindset. The state's suing to get control of a lot of those lands right now, and I think that's an important part of this conversation about who should be managing the land and what should they be managing it for. We skip past that too often to what outcome do we want.
When it comes to I guess federal land and kind of this maybe sometimes a tension between conservation and development, which I mean, not to sidestep the process question. I mean, once we sort of get the right management of lands in the right hands as far as kind of state federal control, but this question of balancing conservation and development, and as an example of that, in a previous role, I worked for the Salt Lake County Council as a policy advisor, and the county council had jurisdiction over canyons. And so we would from time to time have debates about development, stream setbacks, and those kinds of things. And there's sort of a running joke in the world of development in those kinds of environments that how do you tell if you're a developer or an environmentalist? And it's if you already have your cabin in the woods. Yeah. And so there is recognition of tension is maybe a negative way to put it, but I would frame it as a balancing test for things that are both fundamentally valuable. As far as development and growth, but also conserving in the right way. How would you articulate the right balance? What's the right approach as far as maybe a framework that if we're able to have the state of Utah rightfully have better management control over its own land, what would you say would be a good sort of balancing framework for that kind of approach?
So I think the balancing framework is going to require a couple things. One, the right entity should be managing it. And two, the people who have the most skin in the game, so to speak, should be involved in the process. And one of the problems that we always run into in the West with having so much federal land is that those decisions are being made by people who don't necessarily live here. They don't necessarily have the same investment in the area as locals do. And the locals don't get as big of a voice. And, the tension you talk about, I think that's a good thing. It's good for us to have those conversations. How much development do we need versus open space? Local governments are better suited to make those decisions. And like the waters of the U.S. problem we talked about earlier, a lot of people start the conversation with the assumption that if the federal government isn't doing it, states are just going to screw it up. And that isn't really a fair assumption. But even if it were true, you can go to your state legislator. You can go talk to the governor. You can show up at the Capitol during the session and have your voice heard a lot easier than you can fly to Washington, D.C. I mean, if you come, I'll meet with you. I'm easy to meet with, but I'm one of 435 voting members of Congress. And so it's just a lot tougher to turn that ship. So if the federal government's managing something and they're not doing a good job of it, they're not as nimble at changing. But if the state government's managing something and they're not doing a good job of it, a couple hundred people in the state can really raise some cane over that and get heard and have an impact. And so in my mind, that's the process analysis and the outcome analysis you need to go through. Who's most affected by it and do they have a voice in it?
And I'll just underscore that point. And again, this bolsters the argument for federalism. Since I moved to Utah, been here for quite a while now, I've worked in or around the legislature here in Utah in various capacities over the years as a Senate intern, for the governor's office, in a state agency, at the county. I mean, just different, sort of seeing it from different lenses. And I've always been impressed with the Utah legislature that there is a level of access and eagerness to hear from constituents that really can have an impact. And I think, to your point, a lot of folks probably don't know that you can go and testify in a legislative committee. If you reach out to your legislators, there's a genuine desire to hear constituent feedback, and I've seen it make an impact. I've seen it change the trajectory of bills. So there's a responsiveness component at the state level that maybe is harder at the federal level.
And all of our state legislators live in this state. So they have a built-in incentive, even if for some reason they don't care about their constituents at all, which I think they do. If they mess up a watershed, they live with the impacts of that. Where if a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. messes up a watershed in Utah, they may never see it. They may never even realize they messed it up. And so local governments are just more responsive and better at understanding, and they're better at responding to local customs and cultures. And in a nation this big, you need responses that are tailored to state level, county level, city level problems instead of a one size fits all, because one size never actually fits anyone.
That's probably a good way to wrap up. And it kind of in the seconds we have left, my final quick question for you is, I see federalism and elevating this constitutional principle as an antidote to the polarization we feel. It's easy to feel really stressed about the presidential election and who's controlling Congress. And if more of these important policy decisions were happening in state houses where I know I have a voice, it seems like that would take off some of the pressure where I'd feel less stressed about what somebody in Florida or New York thinks about a given issue, because I just need to convince my neighbors and my fellow Utahns. Is that right? Should we sort of remind ourselves that if we want to reduce polarization, we need a little more federalism? Yeah,
I think so. I mean, most people agree that they want the trash picked up on time. Those are the kind of things that you're handling at the local level more. When everybody's watching big federal issues, it's easy to feel like the people on the other side are monsters, or they're coming from a place of ill intent. When you're talking to your neighbors and you want this kind of a curriculum in your local school and they want this kind of curriculum in the local school, your kids are all going to the same school. You're living in the same town. You sort of view them as humans, and it's easier to find common ground. You may not always agree, but you at least know them and understand them. When you're talking about big national issues all the time, it is so easy to polarize. And I've said this for a long time. People know who, a handful of senators and maybe 2 or 3 congressmen are in the whole country. They know who the president is, and they know a couple of cabinet level people. Most people can't tell you who their county commissioners are. They don't know who's on their city council. They probably don't know who their state legislators are. Those people are making decisions that actually impact you. Some of these big national conversations are going to go on for decades, and you're not really going to move the needle much by yelling at the news like my dad does. But you can move the needle a lot by talking to your neighbors about what you want to happen in your town. And if you don't like what's happening in your town and you move to a town that's 50 miles away, that's doable. But getting mad about national politics and leaving the country, people don't actually do that. They threaten to all the time. And so it's harder to polarize on local issues. It's easier to engage and come up with an answer on local issues. Even when you engage on national issues, sometimes it takes so long to get to an answer that we just calcify in our position. So I do think that you're right about federalism and defending the local nature of solutions really helping with the polarization issues.
And what you said, viewing each other as humans, which sadly sometimes we need that reminder.
Yeah.
And actually talking to our neighbors.
Yep. It's harder to assign negative motives to somebody when you know them.
That's an excellent, optimistic way to, I think, wrap up our conversation. I'd love to talk more, but we're trying to be respectful of your schedule and so appreciative of your time talking about these issues and talking about federalism to our audience on Defending Ideas. Representative Maloy, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, we're going to take one final quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, there's one key takeaway that I captured in my notes from our conversation with Representative Maloy, and that's this. If you or I are ever debating really any issue with someone else, whether we agree with them on the issue or not, before we get into the meat of the topic, whatever it is that we're discussing, we first should answer this question: what is the proper role of the federal government versus the state government on this issue? I think far too often when we have policy discussions, we bypass that process question that's embedded in the nature of our constitutional system. And if we do that and we want to jump just right to the outcomes we want or the political perspectives we want, we're going to miss something really important that's embedded in the American system, and that's a disbursement of authority between the federal and state government. And if we get that question right first, that's actually going to create a much better foundation for talking about the issue itself And I think also can bypass a lot of the polarizing debates we have, because as we talked about on a previous episode about federalism, it's a lot easier for me to convince my neighbors and my fellow Utahns about an issue than to try and convince people who live multiple states away. So federalism can be very, very powerful in our policy debates and discussions we have, and answering that question first of the principle of what is the right level of government and the right branch of government to address this issue we're talking about is very, very important. That'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. Thanks for spending some time with us, and I hope that you feel better equipped to defend some of the ideas we talked about today. If you like what you heard, please visit defendingideas.org, subscribe to our show on Apple or Spotify or YouTube. If you click the little bell icon, you'll get notified each time an episode drops on Tuesday morning. And all that and more can be found at defendingideas.org. I also want to thank Zions Bank for bringing this episode to us. They're our sponsor of the 2024 Sutherland Congressional Series. Very grateful to their support of these kinds of conversations. And if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please consider making a contribution to our efforts at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That'll do it for this episode. Thanks for being with us from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.